The most common definition of forced labor has two main components. The first is that the labor must be involuntary and it must be given under the menace of penalty. There's something that's keeping them in that situation. I think that we can't understand forced labor and modern slavery today without understanding all of the big sweeping changes that have happened in the global economy. Over the past 30 years, you've seen dramatic spikes in inequality. On the one hand, you have a huge supply of workers who are more vulnerable than ever to forced labor and to modern slavery, and that's because you have more people than ever who are poor. And on the other hand, you have a rise in a business demand for forced labor and for modern slavery. We can see that business demand for forced labor has really come alongside the normalization of outsourcing. One of the reasons that supply chains have become so global and so complex is that companies at the helm of these supply chains are trying to find ways to make things cheaper, and they're trying to do so in a way that also distances them from responsibility and liability for the labor practices that go into the making of their products. We do see some trend towards forced labor happening in the fringes of supply chains. There are patterns in terms of where forced labor would be most likely to take place in a supply chain. There are patterns about which types of workers would be most vulnerable to forced labor. We know that women and girls, migrant workers, ethnic minorities, indigenous people, people who are poor, are much more likely to be victims of forced labor. As activists and civil society and workers have raised attention to these issues of forced labor, companies have responded by saying, "Don't worry, we can solve this problem ourselves." And one of the ways that they've done that is through corporate social responsibility initiatives. Companies have made codes of conduct that they force their suppliers in other countries to sign on to. And those codes of conduct almost always include a provision that says we forbid the use of child labor, forced labor, modern slavery, human trafficking of any kind in our supply chain. And those codes of conduct are then enforced through private systems of auditing. But there are a number of problems that arise that make auditing very ineffective. One problem is financial conflict of interest between the companies who commission the audit and the companies who perform the audit. The danger of these types of programs is that they're paying that company to rubber stamp that these practices aren't occurring, rather than trying to get to the bottom of why and how these practices are occurring. Another problem with auditing is the actual methodology of how these audits take place. The workplaces that are being audited, they know in advance that the auditors are going to come, and they have the opportunity to rid their production sites of forced labor. They don't always focus on the workforces that are most likely to be vulnerable to forced labor. Another problem with auditing is that there's an institutional design problem. There's a mismatch, essentially, between what we know about forced labor and the portions of the supply chain that are actually audited. I'll give you an example. The big electronics companies, when they do their audits, they always start with their tier 1 factories. So that's where, say, the computer or the smartphone goes through its final assembly and is most closely connected with the brand. But what we know about forced labor is that it may occur in those factories, but it would be much more likely to happen in the sub-tiers of production, in the outsourced parts towards the bottom of the supply chain. For instance, the minerals that get pulled out of the earth, that go into the making of the components that eventually will end up in the smartphone or in the computer. But very, very rarely do audits extend that deep into the supply chain. We often think of governments as the solution to the problem of forced labor. But what we often don't think about is the senses in which governments are also responsible for creating the context in which the problem of forced labor arises in the first place. For instance, in the United States, One of the ways that happens is through immigration law, is through labor law. The deregulation of labor and huge changes in immigration law over the past 30 or so years needs to be understood as part of the issue of how problems like forced labor become widespread. Many governments have stepped up and they've taken on the cause of modern slavery. But on the other hand, their policies don't always support the forms of workers' rights and organization that would get to the root causes of these problems. For instance, if we think about decline of labor inspection, in many countries in the world, you used to have the government playing a much more active role in inspecting workplaces. There are very few boots on the ground to actually make sure that labor laws are being followed. One of the complexities here around the role of government is that many supply chains are global, and so they cut across different national jurisdictions. Yet, labor law in its present form tends to be national. That introduces a number of different problems in terms of governing labor standards in global supply chains. One of the ways that workers and others are trying to get around that now is by proposing a binding global convention on labor standards in supply chains that would make it so that companies who are at the head and the helm of these global supply chains actually have responsibility for ensuring fair labor standards throughout their entire global supply chain. One peculiar thing about a lot of corporate social responsibility programs and audit programs is that they don't really involve workers. And what we really need are supply chain governance solutions that empower workers and involve them. And there are examples of this that already exist. Workers have been at the forefront of pushing for new ways of governing supply chains that would address forced labor and modern slavery, but that would also seek to stretch human rights and enforce human rights across the whole workforce, not only looking at the sort of tip of the iceberg of modern slavery, but ensuring fair labor across the entire sector. A great example of this here in the United States, in Florida, is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. What they've done is said, well, the people who are the best qualified to know what the bad practices are in our industry, why forced labor exists, why modern slavery is thriving in the industry, how people are getting away with it, is actually not outside experts, but it's the workers themselves. And so they have involved, workers have stepped forward to design and enforce their own systems. Is they've said, we can't tackle forced labor and modern slavery without also giving voice to workers and tackling exploitation in the sector at large. Because the same types of business practices that in the extreme form might end up as modern slavery are the same business practices that in a slightly less extreme form are still highly exploitative. And so what we need to be doing is really raising the floor across the board.